In the high plains of the Wyoming Territory, in the fall of 1887, passers-by started noticing something strange at the Thorne homestead. A lone woman, the widow Anna Thorne, was digging a trench, not a ditch for irrigation, not a foundation for a new building. This was a deep, long scar in the earth, running 50 yards from the corner of her cabin's root cellar straight to the door of her small livestock barn. Every day, from sunup to sundown, she was in that trench with a pick and shovel. People riding past on the county road would slow their horses. They saw a woman in her 40s, dressed in her late husband's worn trousers, methodically carving a path into the prairie. They thought she'd lost her mind. They said the grief and the loneliness had finally broken her. And when the winter of 1888 hit, the winter of the Great Blizzard, that crazy trench would prove the difference between survival and surrender. This story isn't just about a strange structure. It's about a number. A single temperature reading taken in the heart of that storm that made the most experienced builders in the territory go silent. If you want to hear that number and understand why it mattered, stay until the end. What did this quiet widow understand about heat, wind, and earth that every seasoned rancher in the valley had missed? Before you tell us in the comments where you're watching from, hit that subscribe button. We've got more stories of frontier ingenuity coming every week. Anna Thorne wasn't trying to revolutionize anything. She was a 45-year-old widow trying to keep her 2 children alive. Her husband, David, a mining engineer from Cornwall, had died of pneumonia 2 years prior, leaving her with a modest cabin, 160 acres of windswept land, and 2 mouths to feed, 10-year-old Samuel and 7-year-old Elspeth. Her background wasn't in engineering. She was a bookkeeper's daughter from back east. But for a decade, she had been married to a man whose entire life was about the underground world. David hadn't just worked in mines. He spoke their language. Over dinner, he wouldn't talk about town gossip. He'd talk about the properties of rock and soil. He'd sketch diagrams on scrap paper showing how to shore up a collapsing shaft, how to manage water seepage, how to ensure a steady flow of fresh air 1,000 feet below the surface. Anna listened. She didn't understand all the mathematics, but she absorbed the principles. The earth isn't just dirt, he'd say. It's a structure. It has rules. He'd talk about the constant, steady temperature below the frost line. Down there, he'd tap the floorboards with his boot. It doesn't know about blizzards. It's always the same. The surface is for weather. The ground is for shelter. That line had stuck with her. By frontier standards, their cabin was respectable. David had built it well. Tightly chinked logs, a good stone fireplace, a deep root cellar that kept their potatoes and carrots from freezing. But their first winter alone, the winter of 86 to 87, had taught Anna a brutal lesson. The cabin itself could be kept livable, but survival depended on the barn. The barn held their 2 milk cows, a handful of chickens, and the hay that fed them. It was only 50 yards away, 50 yards that, in a Wyoming winter, might as well be 50 miles. That winter, she'd had to string a rope between the cabin door and the barn door so she wouldn't get lost in a whiteout. She remembered one morning, with the wind howling and the air a painful 20 below, forcing her way along that rope, one gloved hand over the other. The wind didn't just chill her, it felt like it was physically tearing the heat from her body. The metal handle of the water bucket seared her mittens. The milk she carried back from the cow would have a thin film of ice on it by the time she reached the cabin door. Her children spent that winter huddled by the fire. Elspeth was constantly sick with a cough. Samuel's hands were cracked and raw from bringing in firewood. Anna stuffed rags along the baseboards every evening, only to find them frozen stiff by morning. They burned through their woodpile at an alarming rate, the hungry stove demanding fuel every few hours, day and night. And through it all, Anna observed. She wasn't just enduring, she was analyzing the problem. It wasn't the ambient temperature that was the primary enemy. It was the wind. Wind, she realized, is a force of thermodynamics. Still air, even cold still air, has some insulating properties. But air moving at 50 miles per hour strips heat from any surface, a wall, a bucket, a human body, with staggering efficiency. The rope to the barn wasn't just a guide. It was a lifeline through a 50-yard-long tunnel of relentless heat-stealing energy. One night, staring at the fire, her late husband's words came back to her. The surface is for weather, the ground is for shelter. She looked at the door to the root cellar. Then she looked out the frosted window toward the dark shape of the barn. What if she didn't have to go out on the surface? What if she could go through the ground instead? Her plan was simple in concept, but brutal in execution. She would dig a covered passage, a tunnel. Not a grand piece of engineering, but a humble, stooped walkway, deep enough to get below the wind and just wide enough for her and a bucket. She'd use David's lessons about shoring and drainage. She would connect the shelter of the cabin to the shelter of the barn. She would step out of the weather's way. The work began in late August. She sourced her materials with what little she had. Silas Blackwood, who ran the sawmill, gave her a fair price on rough-cut pine boards and a few sturdy 6x6 timbers. She found a roll of surplus oiled canvas at the general store in town. The rest would be labor, her labor. She started at the foundation of the root cellar, breaking the hard-packed soil with a pickaxe David had used. The first foot was the hardest, a tangled mat of prairie grass roots. Then the soil became more forgiving. She dug down 5 feet, a depth David had told her was well below the frost line in this part of the country. The trench was 3 feet wide. Every shovelful of dirt was a victory, tossed up onto the growing piles beside the scar in the earth. Her son, Samuel, helped where he could, using a smaller spade to clear the loose dirt she broke up. As she dug, she laid a 6-inch bed of coarse gravel along the bottom. This was one of David's rules. "Water is the enemy of any hole, Anna," he'd said. "Always give it a place to go." The gravel bed would act as a simple French drain, keeping the floor of the passage from turning into a muddy soup during a thaw. Then came the timbering. Every 4 feet she erected a simple A-frame from the 6x6 posts, joined at the top with a heavy iron pin. They looked like a series of skeletal ribs lining the trench. This wasn't just for support. It was to create a defined space. Now, here's what made this actually brilliant. The timbers created an inner world, separate from the earth around it. The soil itself would become the primary insulator. Between the A-frames, she lined the earthen walls with the rough-sawn pine boards, creating a wooden corridor. It was crude, with gaps between the planks, but it was solid. It stopped the surrounding dirt from crumbling in. For the roof, she laid heavier 2-inch thick planks across the tops of the A-frames, creating a solid wooden ceiling. Each step was a lesson in physics. She wasn't just building a tunnel, she was creating a zone of thermal stability. The 5 feet of earth on all sides would act as a massive heat sink. In the winter, the ground would slowly release the warmth it had stored all summer, keeping the passage temperature stable, likely just above freezing. The deep winter snow, she knew, would pile on top, adding another layer of phenomenal insulation. She was wrapping her path in a blanket of earth and snow. The work was interrupted by human moments. One afternoon, Elspeth brought her a tin cup of water, her small face full of concern. "Are you tired, Mama?" Anna, leaning on her shovel, her face streaked with sweat and dirt, just smiled. "Tired, yes, but we'll be warm this winter." Silas Blackwood drove past one day, slowing his wagon to a stop. He watched her for a long time, a frown on his face, then just shook his head and clucked to his horses. He didn't even speak. He didn't have to. His expression said it all. Folly. To manage moisture from breathing and from the animals, she designed simple ventilation shafts at either end. These were just small, timber-lined boxes leading to the surface, capped with a little roof to keep snow out. In a blizzard, she could stuff them with straw, allowing for minimal air exchange without letting the wind howl through. It was a system, not just a hole. It was like the dead air in a double-pane window, but on a much larger scale. The still air inside the passage would insulate. The moving air outside could rage all it wanted. It couldn't touch her. After 6 weeks of relentless work, it was finished. She draped the entire wooden structure in the heavy oiled canvas, an extra layer of waterproofing. Then she and Samuel spent a week shoveling the excavated earth back on top, covering the canvas, burying her creation. They packed it down, and finally they laid sections of prairie sod over the mound. From the outside, it looked bizarre. It was a long, low, hump-backed mound, like a Viking burial barrow, connecting the corner of her log cabin to the wall of her barn. It looked like a barn had tried to eat a house and choked. It was unnatural. It broke the clean, flat lines of the prairie. Total cost, under $40. $25 for the lumber, $10 for the nails and hardware, and $5 for the roll of surplus canvas. The rest was sweat. That evening, as the first cold wind of October rattled the window panes, Samuel stood beside her, looking out at the strange new feature of their homestead. "What will people say, Ma?" he asked quietly. Anna didn't look away from the window. "They will say what they wish," she said, her voice steady. "We will be safe." And when neighbors saw it, they didn't see engineering. They saw madness. The ridicule started before the first snow. It began with a visit from Silas Blackwood. He wasn't a cruel man, he was a practical one. He ran the sawmill and had built half the cabins in the valley. He felt a sense of responsibility. He walked the length of the earthen mound, kicking at it with his boot. Anna stood by her door, waiting. "Anna," he said, his voice laced with genuine concern, "I don't think you've considered the frost heave. The ground here freezes solid 4 feet down. When it does, it expands, it moves. It'll lift this whole thing up and snap these timbers like matchsticks. You're building a death trap for yourself and those children." Anna just nodded, her hands tucked into her apron. "I've allowed for it, Silas. The A-frames aren't set on footings. They can shift. Thank you for the lumber." Silas stared at her, frustrated by her calm. He thought she was simply incapable of understanding the danger. He left shaking his head, convinced he'd be back in January to help dig her out of a collapse. The public mockery was crueler. A week later, at the general store, Anna was buying flour when Jedediah Stone, a gruff farmer with a loud voice, saw her. He turned to the men gathered around the stove and said, loud enough for the whole store to hear, "Well, look here, it's the widow Thorne. Heard she's digging her own grave out on her place. Saves the undertaker, the trouble comes spring." A few men chuckled nervously. Anna didn't flinch. She paid for her flour, nodded to the storekeeper, and walked out. But she heard them. The words followed her home, cold and sharp as the wind. The gossip spread through the valley's informal networks. At church, women would whisper behind their hands when she walked past. Men at the trading post started calling her place the Gopher Hole or Thorne's Folly. People she'd known for years would invent reasons to ride the road past her homestead, slowing down to stare at the long green hump of earth. It became a local curiosity, a monument to a widow's grief-stricken madness. The pressure came at her through other women, too. Martha, a senior member of the church sewing circle, stopped by one afternoon with a basket of bread. After the pleasantries, she took Anna's hand. "Anna, dear," she said, her voice soft with pity, "people are worried for you, for your children. They think perhaps you're not coping with your grief. A project like this, it's not natural. It's not what a woman alone should be attempting." This was, in its own way, the cruelest cut. It wasn't an attack on her engineering, but on her sanity, on her fitness as a mother. Anna gently pulled her hand away. "Grief is cold, Martha. I am building against the cold. Thank you for the bread." The institutional skepticism arrived in the form of Mr. Albright, the county extension agent. He was a man who believed in manuals and government bulletins. He was polite but firm. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, hat in hand, standing beside the mound, "I admire the industry, I truly do, but there's no precedent for this in any of our literature. A subterranean passage could fill with snowmelt in the spring. It could trap poisonous air from the livestock, methane, you know. It's just not a sound agricultural practice." "It has drainage," Anna said simply, "and ventilation." "Yes, well," Albright stammered, "be that as it may, it's highly unconventional. I can't officially approve of it." But the cut that went deepest came from family. Her late husband's brother, Thomas, a merchant from Cheyenne, made the trip out after hearing the rumors. He was a man who cared deeply about appearances. He saw the earthen passage, and his face went pale. "Anna, for God's sake, what is this?" he demanded. "People in town are talking. They're saying you've lost your senses, that you can't manage this place alone. They'll use this against you. They'll say David's children are at risk in your care." The unspoken threat hung in the air. They could try to take the children. Anna looked her brother-in-law square in the eye, her voice level and devoid of emotion. "I am not trying to impress the town, Thomas. I am trying to keep David's children alive." By early December, not one person in the valley thought Anna Thorne had solved a problem. They thought she had created one. They looked at her strange earthen tunnel and saw failure, instability, and madness. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just prove Anna right. It redefined survival in the Wyoming high country. Then January came, and it brought the kind of cold that separates theory from reality. The winter of 1888 is still recorded in climatology archives. It's remembered not just for its cold, but for its shocking, brutal violence. It's known as the year of the school children's blizzard. It began on January 12th. The morning was deceptively mild for a Wyoming winter, hovering around freezing. Children went to school in light coats. Ranchers let their cattle roam far from the barns. Then, around noon, the world changed. The temperature dropped not by degrees, but by tens of degrees per hour. A dark, terrifying wall of snow and wind descended from the north. By mid-afternoon, the thermometer at the county seat read minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. By nightfall, it was minus 36 degrees Fahrenheit. And the wind was a physical presence. It was recorded at over 60 miles per hour, a relentless horizontal blizzard that turned the air into a blinding, suffocating sandpaper of ice. It wasn't snow so much as a solid wall of white moving at the speed of a freight train. For 72 hours, the world simply ceased to exist outside the walls of your own cabin. Visibility was measured in inches, not feet. The sound of the wind was a constant, deafening shriek that vibrated through the log walls and floorboards. The stories that came out of that storm became local legend. The Colby Ranch, 2 miles east of Anna, lost over 40 head of prime cattle. They were found a week later, frozen solid where they stood, huddled together against a fence line they couldn't see. Jedediah Stone, the man who had mocked Anna in the store, couldn't make it to his own barn, 100 yards from his house. He tried 3 times and was beaten back, nearly freezing to death himself. He lost his best milk cow and all his chickens. The Miller family, Anna's closest neighbors to the west, heard a sound like a cannon shot on the second night. The roof of their barn had collapsed under the impossible weight of the wind-driven snow. People burned furniture to stay warm. Their wood piles, often just outside the door, were buried under impassable drifts. Several men who were caught out in the open were found dead, some just feet from their own front doors, lost in the white chaos. And then, during a brief lull on the 3rd day, when the wind dropped just enough to see, a neighbor miles away, scanning the horizon with a spyglass, noticed something. He saw the smoke coming from the chimneys of the few scattered homesteads. Most were billowing thick, black, desperate smoke, the sign of a fire being fed anything that would burn, struggling for its life. But the smoke from the Thorne cabin was different. It was a thin, steady, pale gray plume rising calmly into the frigid air. It was the smoke of a well-managed, efficient fire, the smoke of a cabin that wasn't in a desperate fight for survival. Stay with me, because the number that came out of Anna Thorne's humble passage is going to defy everything you think you know about low-tech engineering. The storm broke on the morning of January 14th. The wind died down, and the sun rose on a world transformed and entombed in white. The silence was as profound as the noise had been. The temperature was still a brutal minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit. That afternoon, Silas Blackwood got a few men together. He was a good man, despite his skepticism. He was worried about the widow. He imagined her cabin buried, her timbers collapsed, her family frozen. They loaded a sled with emergency firewood and snowshoes and made their way across the drifts to her homestead. They expected to find a disaster. They expected to have to dig for bodies. When they got within sight of the cabin, they saw the calm plume of smoke and a clear path shoveled from the door. Silas went ahead, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and hope. He knocked on the cabin door. It opened a moment later. Anna Thorne stood there. She wasn't wearing a heavy coat, just a thick woolen shawl over her dress. Behind her, a wave of stable, comfortable warmth washed over Silas, a shocking contrast to the searing cold on his face. It wasn't hot like a blast furnace. It was a living warmth. The air didn't sting his lungs. "Anna," he said, his voice hoarse, "are you all right? We were worried sick." "We're fine, Silas," she said calmly. "A bit of a blow, wasn't it? Come in." He stepped inside, and what he saw crystallized the vindication. Behind her, at the small wooden table, sat Samuel and Elspeth. They were reading a book together. They were wearing normal woolen shirts and trousers, not coats, not blankets, normal clothes. The cabin felt normal. Silas's eyes went to the thermometer on the wall, a fixture in every frontier home. The mercury sat clearly at 58 degrees. 58, he whispered. He was burning through a mountain of wood in his own much larger, well-built home just to keep the temperature in the 40s. "How is this possible? How much wood have you burned?" "The usual amount," Anna said. "Perhaps a little more at night. The wind didn't get in." She nodded toward the simple wooden door that led to the root cellar. "The real difference is the passage." Curiosity overriding his disbelief, he followed her. She lifted the heavy bar on the cellar door and opened it. A cool, earthy smell wafted out. She lit a lantern and led him down the stone steps. At the back of the cellar was a new, low doorway framed with heavy timbers. She unlatched it and gestured for him to go first. Silas had to stoop to enter. He stepped from the cellar into the tunnel. It was dark, silent, and still. The shrieking of the wind, a constant companion for 3 days, was gone, utterly. The air was cold, yes, but it was a dead cold, a still cold. It didn't tear at him. It was the difference between standing in a freezer and standing in a hurricane of the same temperature. Halfway down the 50-yard passage, another thermometer hung from a nail on one of the A-frames. Anna lifted her lantern. Silas leaned in to read the small glass tube. The mercury read 34 degrees Fahrenheit. Let that sink in for a moment. 34 degrees. Outside, the air was minus 25. That was a temperature difference of 59 degrees. The passage wasn't warm. It wasn't meant to be. It was a zone of guaranteed survival. It was the absence of the lethal, wind-driven cold. It meant Anna could walk to her barn, feed her animals, milk her cows, and carry the still warm milk back to her cabin without the slightest risk of frostbite, without getting lost, without spending a single calorie fighting the wind. Her trips to the barn were no more dangerous than a walk to her own cellar. Silas walked the entire length of it. He ran his bare hand over the timbers. They were cold but solid. There was no frost on them, no sign of the heave he had predicted. The structure was sound. He emerged in the small, warm barn, the body heat of the 2 cows and the chickens making the air almost balmy compared to the passage. The animals were fine. They were fed, watered, and calm. He turned and looked back down the dark passage toward the small light of the root cellar. He thought of Jed Stone's dead cow. He thought of the miller's collapsed barn. He thought of his own family, shivering in their home despite a roaring fire. Anna hadn't just built a tunnel. She had built a system that protected her home from the single biggest source of heat loss, The repeated opening of the main door into a blizzard. Her cabin stayed warm because the weather was never invited inside. Silas walked back through the passage, stooping again as he re-entered the cellar. He climbed the steps and stood in her warm cabin, blinking in the light. He looked at Anna, then at her children, safe and reading at the table. He slowly shook his head, a look of profound respect on his face. "We've all been fighting the winter, Anna," he said, his voice low. You just stepped out of its way." The vindication wasn't just in the numbers. It was in the human dignity the passage had preserved. Anna and her children hadn't spent 3 days terrified, listening to the storm try to tear its way in. They had done schoolwork. They had cooked normal meals. They slept through the night. The system turned winter from something to be survived into something to be lived through. A week later, Mr. Albright, the extension agent, arrived. He had heard the incredible stories and came with a calibrated thermometer and a notebook. He measured the outside temperature, then the temperature inside the passage. He logged the numbers, shaking his head in amazement. Anna showed him her meticulous records, dates, temperatures, and fuel consumed. This wasn't luck, it was data. Word spread through the valley not like a rumor, but like a revelation. By February, half the county knew that the Widow Thorne's Folly had been the smartest piece of engineering anyone had seen in a generation. The first convert was the widow Miller. Her barn had been destroyed, her livestock exposed. She came to Anna not for pity, but for advice. Anna, with help from a now devoutly convinced Silas Blackwood, helped her design a simpler version. Not a tunnel, but a deep, timber-lined, sod-covered lean-to built against the side of her cabin, creating a half-buried shelter for her remaining animals. It worked perfectly. By the next fall, 3 more families had dug their own versions of thorn passages. They were ugly, disruptive things to build, but they were practical, and after the blizzard of '88, no one cared about aesthetics anymore. They cared about what worked. Within 5 years, a dozen homesteads in the valley had a long, low mound of earth connecting their 2 most important buildings. Mr. Albright, the extension agent, wrote a formal report. It was titled Subterranean Stock Passages for High Plains Homesteads. It was filled with temperature data, diagrams, and construction advice. In the introduction, it credited the design to the remarkable foresight of a widow in Laramie County. The bulletin was distributed by the Territorial Extension Service and became a minor classic of frontier architecture. What Anna Thorne had built, using intuition learned from a Cornish miner and the brutal lessons of her first winter alone, was a crude but perfect form of earth-sheltered construction. She was nearly a century ahead of the building scientists who would rediscover and formalize the very same principles. Years later, when a visiting journalist asked her why she had thought to dig the tunnel when no one else had, her answer was simple. She just repeated the words her husband had taught her. "The surface is for weather," she said. "The ground is for shelter." It seemed the most logical thing to do. Today, the homestead is long gone. The cabin and barn have collapsed back into the prairie. But if you know where to look, you can still see it. A long, shallow depression in the earth, a gentle swale 50 yards long, tracing the line where a determined woman once carved a path to survival. The frontier was an unforgiving place. It didn't reward stubbornness or tradition for their own sake. It rewarded observation, It rewarded adaptation. It rewarded what worked. Anna Thorne didn't invent a new tool or a fancy machine. She just used the oldest and most reliable shelter there is, the Earth itself. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? And what's the coldest winter you've ever had to face? Subscribe for more proven frontier techniques every single week. This video presents a historically inspired reconstruction of frontier life. The characters and specific events are fictional, but the engineering principles and the historical context of the 1888 blizzard are based on real accounts and practices from the period.